was actually a different topic I wanted to bring up, and this is, I think, what made me first reach out was you had made a post, and I should find it and include it later on, but you had made a post about a lot of misguided ideas on hypertrophy. And one of the things that you had said was that you said no serious researcher considers metabolites to be hypertrophic. Do you
Right.
remember that post generally?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
And I would just like to expand on that because that is
Yeah.
something that, metabolite training and the idea
Sure.
of all of that is often talked about. So maybe you could
Right.
elaborate on that.
Yeah. So I'll sort of I'll trace this back to I think some of the I'll call it the origin of a lot of theories in hypertrophy that stem from the observed difference between how power lifters and bodybuilders well they how they look and then how they perform as well. So uh, bodybuilders, a lot of volume. You test them as a 1RM compared to, say, a power lifter, and they're a lot weaker. And that led to one of the, I think, biggest red herrings that's out there is the idea that there's a different type of hypertrophy with bodybuilders that they gain sarcoplasm. So they called it sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, which again, Mike Robertson, Brad Schoenfeld, and I have bashed back and forwards on Twitter, on X, whatever you call it these
Yeah,
days.
yeah, yeah.
Um, and I think we can all agree that it's probably small if it exists. We've tried to find it. We don't see any evidence of it, but Mike Roberts' group has done some good work in the area. And again, maybe it's there. If it is, it's transient. Or if you do see it, you see it in guys who are admittedly steroid users, and there is some sort of expansion of the fiber that appears to be non-myofibrillar. So we'll call it sarcoplasmic. But one of the other things is that arose from a similar type of observation, of course, is that if you're doing lots of volume like that, then you're building up lots of metabolites, and that explains the hypertrophy, because the theory at the time was that everything was load driven. Is that loads were the key part, and again, like, that theory's been busted wide open now, and sort of load, yes, to a certain extent, but volume and proximity to, I'll call it, momentary muscular failure is a bigger driver of growth than load per se. So if you can get growth with 20% of 1 RM, which is, it's a pretty light load. It's not, it's
Hmm.
not, it's not picking up and lowering a pencil for sure. So there is something that you have to do
Yeah.
load wise. Then it really suggests that load's not a big deal. But the idea was is that the metabolites that accumulate intracellularly are somehow turning on processes of hypertrophy. And one of the observations is always, the track and field events that result in some of the greatest lactates I've ever seen. So 400, 800, 1500 meters, and even the 3000, 5000 meter guys and women have lactates that are far higher than you would see at the end of a resistance training workout. And yet,
Right, right.
they're not huge individuals. 400-meter runners, big guys. 800, not quite as big. 1500, 3000, 5000, they're small people.
Yeah.
Uh, but no muscle growth.
All
So,
right.
and that I guess that kind of sums it up in a
Yeah,
little
yeah.
bit, a nutshell. But
So back up a little bit for people who maybe aren't aware. So like I remember even when I was getting into this, and there was this talk about, okay, there's myofibrillar hypertrophy and sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. And,
yeah,
and I mean,
yeah,
some even presented it as if it was 50-50. You could do heavy loads, and that's the
yeah,
myofibrillar, and the sarcoplasmic, that's the pump, the metabolites, and that's
sure.
why the bodybuilders have these full muscles. And I mean, it was like a whole thing.
Yeah.
And so you're saying that basically we don't see that. If it exists, it's very minimal.
Yeah, I mean, even like some of the extreme volume studies that are out there, and Cody Hahn did one when he was with Mike Roberts as a PhD student, and like an extraordinarily high number of sets, sort of 50 plus sets per week per body part. And when you look at the responders in that study, they tend to get a bigger gap between myofibrils within the myofiber. So that's the sarcoplasm, or I'll just call it non-myofibrillar, so non-force generating. And but it's very small, and that's only really in the guys who responded to that type of training. So it's not the 50-50, or it's not even a like even a large proportion. And part of the point I make to people is to talk about intraatomic distances within a cell. So when you begin to swell the fiber, and if 50% of the fiber were not contractile tissue, it would be a thermodynamic disaster to try and get ATP to the site that you would use it. And I know that's
Mm.
getting right into the nitty-gritty, but
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
if you do the calculations, it's a diabolical problem. It would, bodybuilders they'd fall over. They do 1 or 2 or 3 reps, and then,
yeah, yeah.
diffusion distances would be so great that it just wouldn't happen. So it may be there. And when I think, not to put words in Mike's mouth, but Mike Roberts is sort of the idea that that expansion kind of primes the muscle for a little bit of growth. And it could be even that the mitochondria respond to that to generate energy to kind of, respond to a little bit of a crisis. So I'm not saying it's not there, but if it is there, it's generally, I think it's transient and relatively small. So it's definitely not the bodybuilder's fibers fill up with, I'll say water for lack of
Yeah.
a better word, but non-contractile protein or yeah, space.
Were
It's
you
just not
saying
there.
he was saying it's possible that it is almost a step before the myofibrillar hypertrophy occurs? You said it's almost like preparing for that
Yeah.
next growth.
Yeah, he calls it sort of priming, and I think if you took muscle biopsies, or if you had animals that you took the muscles from, maybe at the right spaces in the training program, or during some big volume periodization, that you could see something like that. But it's even in his hands, it's a relatively small, and maybe I think if I'm interpreting what he's saying correctly, short-lived phenomenon. In other words, it primes the system, and then the system kind of backfills in with the contractile proteins. So, and Troy Hornberger is another guy who, and this guy, he lives and breathes this stuff. And he and his PhD student Kent Jorgensen and I wrote a really, I mean, those guys did the majority of the work, and Kent drew some amazing figures for a review paper. And we looked really hard for this, and in conclusion, all of the evidence that this existed was really from cross-sectional studies where guys were taking, admittedly, very high doses of steroids, and
Mm.
then you begin to see things that I think are not the norm.
Right, right, right. Sure.